It turns out the greatest threat to Nazi Germany wasn't tanks or planes or armies. It was a printer, and a couple of college kids with the audacity to hand out pamphlets. Meet Sophie Scholl, a 21-year-old student who proved that sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't a sword, but a stack of paper and the courage to say, "This is wrong." Let's rewind. Germany, early 1940s. The Nazi regime is at its peak. Hitler controls everything. The schools, the newspapers, the radio, even what you're allowed to think. If you even hint at dissent, you vanish. People are terrified and most stay silent, but not everyone. Enter Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans, just regular college students at the University of Munich. They liked books, music, philosophy. They were young, idealistic, and, here's the crazy part, they still believed in human decency at a time when their entire country was drowning in fascism. Hans and Sophie, along with a small circle of friends, created Die Weiße Rose, the White Rose. Sounds poetic, right? That was the point. They weren't carrying guns or plotting assassinations. Their weapon of choice was words, pamphlets, leaflets, essays that called out the Nazis for what they were, liars, murderers, criminals dragging Germany into ruin. And here's the irony. For a regime obsessed with silencing opposition, these little sheets of paper were like dynamite. Every time the White Rose printed and distributed a batch, it was another crack in Hitler's carefully constructed illusion of unity. Picture it. Sophie and Hans lugging around stacks of forbidden flyers, sneaking them into mailboxes, dropping them in stairwells, leaving them at the university for other students to stumble upon. Each leaflet was basically a giant middle finger to the Gestapo, and they weren't vague either. These weren't, "we don't like war" generic statements. Nope. The leaflets flat out condemned Hitler. They wrote things like, "We will not be silent, we are your guilty conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." That's not subtle protest, that's "please arrest me" levels of defiance. Now here's where the story turns tragic and powerful. On February 18, 1943, Sophie and Hans brought a suitcase full of pamphlets to the University of Munich. They scattered them through the halls, leaving them where students would find them between lectures. And then, in a moment equal parts genius and reckless, Sophie went up to the top floor and flung the last batch of flyers into the courtyard below. Papers rained down like confetti. It was bold. It was beautiful. It was also the exact moment the janitor spotted them and called the Gestapo. Hans and Sophie were arrested on the spot. Within days they were interrogated, tortured, and put on trial. The judge, Roland Freisler, the hanging judge of Nazi Germany, famous for screaming at defendants until their sentences were basically foregone conclusions. And here's Sophie, 21 years old, staring down a regime built on terror, knowing she's about to die. Did she beg for her life? Nope, she doubled down. At her trial she said, "What does my death matter if by our actions thousands are warned and stirred to action?" That's not just courage, that's defiance distilled into pure steel. On February 22, 1943, Sophie, Hans, and their friend Christoph Probst were executed by guillotine. Guillotine, in the 1940s. The Nazis were so desperate to make an example of them that they used medieval brutality to silence a few students with a typewriter. But here's the kicker, it didn't work. The Nazis killed the White Rose, but they couldn't kill what it stood for. The leaflets Sophie and Hans wrote were smuggled out of Germany, reprinted by the Allies, and dropped from planes all across Europe. Their words spread farther in death than they ever could have in life. Think about that for a second. The most powerful dictatorship in history was terrified of teenagers with a mimeograph machine. And they were right to be. Because fear can control people, violence can silence them, but ideas spread. Ideas outlast. Sophie Scholl became a symbol of conscience, of bravery, of what it means to resist when resistance feels impossible. She was only 21, but her words carry more weight than the armies she never commanded. And here's the ultimate irony. The Nazis thought they were silencing her. Instead, they made her immortal. Today, schools, streets, and squares all across Germany bear her name. Statues stand where she once walked. She is remembered as one of the greatest heroes of her generation, and her execution, it only proved her point. So, let's recap. Sophie Scholl, armed with nothing but paper and conviction, terrified the most brutal regime in modern history. She was executed for pamphlets. But her words became stronger than the Gestapo, louder than Hitler, and more enduring than the Reich itself. It turns out the greatest threat to fascism isn't an army. It's the truth, whispered, printed, copied, and spread by people who refuse to shut up. If Sophie Scholl's story moved you, or at least made you realize that words can sometimes be sharper than any sword, share this video. Here on History's Greatest Moments, we bring you the unbelievable stories that prove history isn't just dates and names, it's courage, defiance, and sometimes a stack of pamphlets. So hit subscribe, smash that like button, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next jaw-dropping story. Because whether it's heroes, geniuses, or rebellions written on scraps of paper, if we don't tell these stories, who will?